I'm Clem Clark and I am the webmaster of the ecoplatform.com website, a website that John James and I set up to plan for the future of climate change and the problems that it is bound to bring to us, and to plan what we can do to help save the world and make it a more pleasant place to live. This is John James's presentation from late 2018. In this talk, John talks about the 11 years that the United Nations feels that we have to alter our plans for the future of planet Earth. In fact, the situation has got much worse in the intervening years, but here are John's thoughts and considered opinions as a climate change expert and architect.
To discuss what we might be able to do and what might happen. Here we are. This guy's really interesting. He's been advisor on climate affairs to the Pope and to Merkel and to the Common Market. You can all hear that?
Yeah, much better.
All right, good. And we've really got to think about what a guy like this says when we say it. And what the report is saying is that we've got to get our act together significantly within 4 years. Now, we've been going now for close on 60 years in conferences about how to make the world better, and none of them have done anything. But what we need to think about is this figure correct? And is 12 years possible? There are two questions. Now, the way the IPCC works is very simple. 1 million committees decide who's going to write the great reports, and then they select among these fellows here on the right, who are among the scientists who are involved in this, to actually write the report. Then the politicians get to work, and they mass out. And the IPCC report final is a highly, that's not just those good work, but simply censored report. And these are the ones responsible for the final report. None of whom are trustworthy. It means that the report is fantastically interesting and a real kick up the butt, but it's meaningless. And it's meaningless for a couple of really important reasons. The first reason is, and I'll put this on the slide, it doesn't include methane, tipping points, the fact that things can happen in a catastrophic, non-linear way. Most importantly, aerosol, all of which I'll describe to you, and the albedo and C4, etc., etc. In other words, it's not only a manicured report, it is a partial report of our reality. In it, there are 5 deliberate deceptions and 10 deliberate omissions. And this is what we need to look at in order to understand what's happening. The first deception is, of course, what do we base our 1.5 degrees by 2030? What do we base that 1.5 on? 1.5 about what? The time of Jesus Christ? In fact, they base it on the 1951 to 1980 average, which means today's temperature is not quite 1 degree. Now, we all know that it doesn't feel like that. You could go to an earlier average, like 1890, or you can go to an average that really matters, which is when we started our industrial civilization and began to throw coal into the air. So if we go back to here, our baseline is 0.7 of a degree above where they're talking, in which case we're probably looking at, if you want to come forward, you can't see it, right? Probably looking at well over 2 degrees effective heating at the moment. So the rest is plain, easily understood as propaganda, but nevertheless propaganda. The second deception is about acceleration. They don't mention that what we've been dealing with is in fact a parabolic curve, as temperatures increasingly heat by an accelerated amount each year. Now I've mentioned these here. This is the average increase per year. And you can see that the rate is actually going up. We're having to deal with more and more consequences of fossil fuels expandingly affecting the environment. It's not linear. What we all know with parabolic curves like this in natural phenomena is that they go up and they continue to go up and they continue to go up and they reach a point at which something very serious happens. That's what we're doing. This did not come in before. One of the influences of the report is that if you look back over the last X million years, we've been suffering in and out of glacial conditions and non-glacial conditions. Ice everywhere and there's no ice. It's been doing this on a fairly regular basis. And what the report rightly says is we've actually shot ourselves out of that, like a satellite leaving Earth, and into a new trajectory. Now, the implication is that we can come out of here and we can come back again. And I'm going to try and show you that's not on. That we're on a trajectory that is going to be not necessarily inevitable, because we could theoretically stop soon, but it's going to very seriously take us into a very wrong trajectory. Yet they tell us in the report, an enormous amount of language, that we can solve the problem by getting rid of the CO2 in the air. I shall look at this and see. It's important we recognise just what that statement is. So, the emissions. This is an extremely interesting graph introduced by Sam Conrad. Now, what he's done, in a somewhat mechanical way, he's tried to make this point as best he can, is add together where we are with various other rises, and then just look at the things not included. And he goes through these various ones now, which is the list here that I showed you before of what's been omitted. And these omissions are crucial, because the Earth is a gigantic object. You don't simply change something here and find out the switch to change it everywhere. The Earth takes time, it's like a gigantic firewall. It's got to actually catch up to itself. So when you have a change in one process of a large nature, you've got to wait for a while for that to actually filter through and affect everything else. So when we look here at this, what he's saying, and what I think figures do show us to some extent, is that we're on the way to produce a very much bigger figure than we already do, if we add all this together. Nature doesn't work by additions. We might be looking at 5 degrees, maybe 4.5. We're not looking at less than that. So these are fairly catastrophic levels as far as we as human beings are concerned. Now, the aerosol, at the top one on the list. I think most of you understand what this aerosol issue is. But I'll put a little drawing here. That everything we produce has pollution. And that goes up into the air and it sits in the air forming a blanket around the earth. And that blanket actually limits the amount of CO2 that comes into the planet. So the heating that should be coming into the planet would be a lot more if that was not right. Aeroplanes and other things were all affected. That's the simple statement. It's a blanket of pollution. Now, we put it up there, and this is the paradox. That having put it up there, we've actually inured the Earth to lower the heat that is possible for us to be, that we should have actually had by now. And were to fall over the sky, let's say that all industrial production stopped tomorrow. If that were to happen, that is a huge financial factor. It would virtually be the same as what happened in America after 9/11, in a very small way, when they stopped all the airplanes. And at that moment, then, there wasn't that much coming out of the sky from aeroplane emissions, and the temperatures changed. It was noticeable. This is what would happen here. If we get a sudden and catastrophic rise in temperature, were we to stop pollution. And pollution is the one thing none of us want to see. We want our clear skies back. We want birds flying without falling out of the sky because of the pollution they're doing, etc. We want our kids not being able to go out. We don't want more Beijings and so on the planet. But the moment we do, this is the price we're going to pay. And a lot's been written about this. I'm just showing you a few of the things that have been written to explain what this is all about. And this term, hothouse Earth, has been creeping up a great deal. Hothouse meaning to put anything else out there into the air at all, that the Earth will, from its own mechanisms, continue to create more and more CO2, and at that point we can't stop it. These are called tipping points, where the Earth gets to some point where it produces more CO2 out of its own mechanisms. And this is something we're all trying our hardest to avoid. But the increasing rate at which CO2 is coming into the atmosphere is suggesting that in some respects we've already passed those points. I've read papers where it's reckoned that there are 4 major tipping points which have already been passed. In other words, we can sit back in our chair, not produce anything more out of our industrial society, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere will continue to increase. That's what a tipping point is. So it's a very important point. Now, the second emission is the albedo effect. Albedo means reflection. So the sun's rays hit water, and 93% of the heat in those rays goes into the water. When it hits snow and ice, almost the same amount gets reflected. So removing the ice cover in the Arctic has an enormous impact on the amount of heat that the Earth receives. No, that's back. Sorry. So you can see how in the Arctic over time we're losing more and more ice. We're almost at the point now where in summer we'll have an ice-free Arctic. Now, this can be a headline in the paper, but it actually means at that point that the amount of extra heat coming onto the Earth will be about equivalent to the heat output of all the cars in the Earth at the moment. This is not a small amount. These are big things. And once you start to change this, I mean, we were all taught at school about the jet stream. This vast mass of air that runs around the Earth at a high altitude and forms the main climatic matrix and actually is itself maintained by the difference between cold in the Arctic and heat in the equator. When you change that heat differential, the jet stream tends to break up. And what happens is something rather like this. You start getting this sort of jet stream. It even breaks up into bits. It stops running in bits. This is what we're doing in the northern hemisphere. This hasn't hit the southern hemisphere yet, but it's very much in the north. So, the consequence of that is you'll get a big storm, and because the jet stream is not moving the storm on, it's actually holding it in one place. That storm concentrates in that place and stays there and doesn't move on. The heat wave they had in Europe recently. The jet stream brought it in and simply dropped it, and there it stayed. So you don't just get a storm, or a bigger storm, but you get one that does not go away. You probably all remember that film. What was it called?
That one.
That one. I keep thinking Tomorrow's World, but it wasn't that. That was my film.
Day After Tomorrow?
Day After Tomorrow. I knew somebody would know. And that was the theory behind that, which apparently, based on good science, that you could have a massive storm somewhere and it wouldn't move. It would just stay there. And this is the point here in this article, that once you start doing that, you start to not only get extreme weather, but extremely extreme weather. And we've noticed that again. You just watch the way the storms are coming nowadays, and they are outside the definitions. They're outside normal. And of course the response has to be even bigger. And the destruction to infrastructure is greater. And then more money is needed to repair that infrastructure if we do it. So what happens to these jet streams is really important. And this distortion of the jet streams in the north is beginning to work in the south as well, because they're crossing over, and even though it's the Arctic that's getting all the heat, those jet streams are affecting us down here. So we do have some reflection of that. We're not totally inured. I wish we were. The number 4 is methane. Now, I've talked quite a bit about methane. Just, I'll say a little bit about it to sort of fill you in. Because the importance of methane is that it's somewhere between, roughly about 28 times more powerful as a gas than CO2. It doesn't last as long. You put it up in the air, but its impact on global warming is far greater. The amount of methane stored, mainly in permafrost areas, and a lot of it under the water, is just so vast. Mainly in these yellow areas here, and a little bit in the brown areas. This is where we find methane stored in permafrost. And the quantities are just mind-boggling. They are so huge that what we've put already into the air by CO2 is minuscule. When you study carefully the charts of past history, and we go back X hundred million years to look at the previous times when we've had surges in temperature on this planet. What happens each time is that you get a bump up in CO2, followed by a little bump from methane, which triggers a bigger bump from CO2, which triggers a massive shoot up from methane. Methane is the gas each time that triggers the real problem. So we need to be highly respectful of what's sitting up in that area, and this is the area that's getting hotter than anywhere. This woman is now head of one of the big university departments, and she did the research in the Siberian area, which is where all that permafrost and methane is, and this was her comment. And that we've really got to take some thinking about. Scientifically, there's a lot of argument about whether she's right or not, because it hasn't happened, so we don't know. But she says, and I really trust a lot of what she says, she says this is highly possible at any moment, because if it happens, we will get exactly what's happened in times of the past. A sudden burst of methane. Now, the literature calls it a burp. I suppose that's a fair enough comment. Particularly when you see what it actually looks like. Now, this is a small burp in Siberia. It came from methane down underneath. It concentrated and virtually blew a hole, which is about a bit less than a kilometre deep, the depth at which this methane was collected. And this is in the middle of the tundra. Now, what they hope does not happen, but in fact the evidence is that this is what does happen, is that once this gets to a certain point, you don't get a single burp, but you get bop, 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 bop. They set each other off. So you get a whole series of them. And that's the way that this 50 gigatons of methane could happen. So methane is a real problem, and as you can see coming back to our chart down here, he's talked about sea methane, which is methane, it's clathrate, it's frozen, kept solid by pressure under the sea. But he hasn't talked in this about what would happen if we had a burp of methane. You simply write your checkbooks and give it up. But water vapour is the fifth one. Now, water is a natural greenhouse gas. And for a long time people were arguing that the real problem was not CO2, but water vapour. But in fact, it's a water vapour comes, of course, when the world becomes hotter, and it goes into the air, and it does act in the same way as CO2. So what he's done over here is he's added these things together. A very unlikely scenario, because things are much more complicated in nature, but he's trying to make the point that I'm trying to make. We are in very, very dangerous country. And the IPCC reports, by not going into these, by being politically exercised, so this information is not there, gives us a false feeling that we're, in fact, a lot better off than we are. Now, omissions. It's getting to a point in some countries where it's going to be too hot to go outside. Not all the time, of course, but when it gets really hot, these are the most obvious ones to think about. And this is dry bulb heat. If it's wet bulb, humid country, it's of course much worse. The human body is not meant to sustain these temperatures. But we're beginning to make these temperatures permanent. So many parts of the world as mentioned here, we're just going to have to put up with being unable to work outside. And of course, then the whole thing applies to how do you grow crops? How do you get out there and even bring up more oil out of your oil wells? How do you ride your camel across the desert? How do you ride a car? It's too hot. There's no air conditioning system that would deal with that. And apparently it includes northern India and eastern China. Incredibly dense populations. And as far as China is concerned, and India now more and more so, industrial heartlands in this world. Who's going to go to their factory at 55 degrees? Anybody?
John, just as a point, in 1979 through to 83, we lived in Saudi Arabia and the outside temperature was about 45 degrees. It was just unbearable.
Exactly. Add 10 to that,
No crops then.
and what happens?
Everyone turns on the air conditioners.
Right, which comes from power and electricity.
Yeah.
And no one's yet introduced the rule that says if you put in an air conditioning set, it's got to be solar heated.
Yeah, not then.
Because when the sun's out, my air conditioning is needed, and it works. And that's a law we should have had in this country a decade ago.
Why don't they build houses to suit the conditions? The conditions weren't
Sorry?
always.
Why don't they what?
In Saudi.
What did you say?
Why don't they build the houses to suit the conditions?
That's,
To suit the, why didn't they
Oh, to
build
suit
the
the
houses
conditions.
to suit the conditions?
well, that's another question. I've worked in Sweden where they tried to put Swedish houses in British West Africa.
Well, they did in Bahrain, and people couldn't stand the air conditioning, so they left all the flats and houses and went back to live in the desert.
Yeah.
This is very real. The air conditioning system
They
they
have
ceased
suit the conditions.
at those temperatures.
No, they didn't like it. They didn't like it. So they went down.
And this is a very real issue, this lack of, this increased heat.
I digress, sorry.
And this was the study that was done of India and China. And where do we buy most of our goods from nowadays?
Yes.
And these people are working in hot factories. Blah-de-blah. Now, I could go on with this for a long time, but I don't need to. I think you've got the point. Now, the other thing is population. Now, the driver of all of this, we know, is manufacturing, use of fossil fuels. But what drives all of that to an impossible situation is the number of people. This is an issue that nobody has really faced up to. On population, we can cope. Population, we'll deal with it later. Too many religious taboos, etc., etc. Fundamentally, we've too many people. Now, I'll come to this next point later. But this is an interesting map because the size of the countries reflects the number of people. So Australia is down here. It's a sort of rubber map. I don't know how many of you remember the 1972 publication, The Club of Rome, republished many times. They looked at the primary forces at this time in the world, resources, births, deaths, etc., etc., and how they linked. It was a relatively simplistic program, but turns out to have been really pretty accurate in the long term. They're looking, for example, as resources become scarcer. And we're somewhere about here. Look how much effort it takes now to get oil. You used to put your finger in the ground and find oil. Now you've got a frack, chemicals, all this sort of stuff, pull it out with pumps, and we think we have a lot. We're just pulling out the last bits. Rare metals. All this electronic stuff we have operates on rare earths. And The amount of that in the world is relatively small, which is why it's called rare earth. And yet we're wanting to go on expanding. Yet, as resources get less, certain things follow. And as services, which is mainly health services, increase, everything because of resources and the number of people and the growing population, they all have an impact on each other. And their argument in 1972, back here, was that we would meet some point of inflection about now. It might be this year, it might be 10 years' time. But that about now suggests that we've got to think very clearly about these things, and the main thing driving this is population. We didn't have as many people, least of all as many people wanting to have the same standard of living as we have, then things would be better. And we could probably have our industrial society, and with a bit of care get away with it. But we've got 8 million people instead of 1.5. So, just to summarise this so far, the deceptions, temperatures misleading, acceleration, hope that we can get it better, and population uncontrollable. And the omissions, the ones I've gone through. Now there are more. And a few words about them all. Insect loss. Now we've recently recognised this. I mean, when I was a kid and I'd drive in the bush, you'd have to stop every now and again and wipe your windscreen. When's the last time I did that? So the insects are not there. If my insects are not there, what do my birds eat? What do other insects eat? What are bees? And if I lose bees, and I mean, there are many species of bees, we think there's just a few. Apparently, something like 300 species of bees just in New South Wales.
2,000 in Australia.
2,000?
Over 2,000 species of native bees in Australia.
In Australia?
In Australia.
So, you probably know extremely well which ones are happy with the way things are, and which ones are not.
We don't see those numbers of European swarms you used to see now too because of disease. So, you know, in the old days you could pick up a swarm any time and they're just not there anymore.
Yeah. We did in the 60s. We picked a swarm up, put them in a box, have their honey. Where's that now? Glyphosates, etc., whatever we're doing, it's wrong. So, insect loss, this is such an indication of what is happening. And our response to it is indicated by the slightly humorous headlines. That they can't cope with the reality of this. I'd like to move around. You've got a... Would you like to move around? You might get over here. You go over there. Go over there.
You can see it when we stay here.
Yeah. Sure. If you want it. And pollution doesn't only kill. Pollution actually makes it more difficult for you to do your daily job. You get ill, you get undermined, these things happen, and you're left without the same vitality. So pollution is more than just the air you breathe. The consequence again comes back to farming and food, and can we keep up the amount of food that's required to look after everybody. And again, the headlines. Heaps and heaps of this stuff being published, and the impact, frankly, is that we all get more upset, more worried, but the change is virtually nil. And the same with crop loss. On current, looking at climate change at 1.5 degrees, there's 36% fall in rice production. Wheat 18%, corn 45%. Since corn is the basis of most industrial food, this again is serious. And how many more people are there in the world by then? And the fisheries? We know what we're doing to fisheries. We're wiping them out. We are consistently becoming the major source of extinction on the planet. It'll catch up with us. And this is not, again, not mentioned at all as part of the IPCC report. And yet the consequence of that for the health of the world is inestimable. We are a totally holistic environment in which every little insect plays some part for some animal, plays some part for the way the weather goes, plays some part for the health of the soil, and so on and so on. We can't pull these things apart and simply say, oh, it's a pity there are less insects. Because the implication of that on every other species and everything else that used to work on the planet is just horrendous. And of course, we've got our friend bushfires, which we had here in midwinter. And we had a really big one in big winter, so much so then that anybody who wanted to do any burning off since then, even in a controlled environment, has been told, no, it's too dry. This is dryness that is deeply penetrating our soils. And it's happening not just where we live. Yes, you all remember that just too well. But the consequence of fire, of course, is that the grasslands, when they burn, are no longer any good for cattle until you get enough rain to grow the grass back again. Houses burn. We need a great deal of funding to rebuild those houses. And we're having more and more trouble getting insurance policies. There's a diminution in the asset value of our community the more and more this happens.
I renew my GIO policy changed it, and they said they don't do insurance for country houses anymore.
Wow.
That was
There we
I
are.
was really shocked. Because we were there in the rain, I thought I'd get another quote. GIO don't want to know.
There'll be more of that. And with sea level rise, again there'll be more. And with a lot of other things there'll be more. In the end they'll insure you for nothing, but you'll still pay. In fact, this is a photograph of Venice during the floods. This wasn't sea level rise, this was just a flood. But a flood like they'd never ever had. We're going to have loss of cities. And since half the world's population is now moving into cities, that's incredibly destabilizing. I've seen photographs from the air of Mexico City, and all you see is accommodation for people over an enormous landscape, a landscape that used to be semi-agricultural. And the south, which is us, the southern hemisphere, will tend to get drier. This is the forecast. And the northern hemisphere will tend to become wetter. So they'll have more of those storms, and we'll have more of the other. Now, have a look. What do you notice in that photograph?
She saved her shoes.
She's off there shopping. In spite of the flood, in spite of everything. This courageous girl, she's off shopping. And she's making sure it doesn't get wet. And this is, I think, the other part of our real problem, and it's another omission. How do we deal with consumerism? And this is a question I keep asking myself. How come that oil production, for the first time in history, is about to go to 100 million barrels a day? I know the price is going down, but there's lots of it. How does every industry expect, not just oil, but coal and everything else, expect to be selling more for the next X years. And this is it. It's pointless consumption. In my house, I have 3 computers. That's pointless. One of them. Same applies to most of our things. I've got far more shirts than I need, far more trousers. We all have far more of everything. When I was a kid, I had 2 shirts. And I felt good. I went and washed them regularly, and I mended them when I needed to. I even learned how to mend stockings on a nicely shaped piece of wood and mend the heel. We don't bother anymore. We pick up the old stocking with a hole in it and we toss it. And that means I've got to go and consume and buy another one. And as I literally am, I'm eating the earth. That's a very good article, George Monbiot's. You might like to get hold of it and read it. So, that's omission number 12. Now we come to the 5th deception. Carbon capture. Everyone who's written about the IPCC report, and I'm not forgetting that in the course of this talk, says they present us with an answer, which is we can capture carbon. Frankly, bullshit. We can, and there are attempts to capture carbon, and it's a vast industrial undertaking with all of the environmental costs that such industrial things demand. Now, not only is it the very size of the equipment, but it uses heaps and heaps of toxic chemicals, because we pull the air in and then we've got to take that air and we've got to mix it with something to extract the CO2, and then it is turned into something solid. And what do? We've got to bury it or something, and the amount of energy used is virtually the same as the energy the coal produced in the first place. So we've had 150 years of burning coal, and we're going to have to use a similar amount of energy to construct this industry and run this industry and feed it with chemicals in order to get that CO2 back again. Nature did it so easily. It simply got the CO2 into trees, let the trees die, put them underground and buried them under pressure. It took a few million years, but nature knew how to do it. We have ignored that, and we simply spent it like this, and now we're expected by IPCC to solve the problem by paying industry more money to make more profits to deal with the problem that should never have been there in the first place. Energy cost is about $100 per tonne. Now we have thrown up into there something in the order of 750 gigatons. Now let's just talk about size for a minute. 1 billion. Now the next one up is a gigaton, or tera, however you want to, whichever zone it is in. But 1 billion, you know how much money 1 billion is? Does it want to pay you $1,000 a day, every day, for your whole of your life? You're born, you get $1,000. And then every day you get $1,000. By the time you die as an old man, how much money would I have given you? You can work that out. So, suppose I'm going to do that for you and your family forever. How many years do I have to continue doing that to spend $1 billion? Well, if I go back to the time of Christ, I haven't even gone back far enough. About 3,000 years it takes to pay $1 billion. So, when we start talking about a gigaton or $1 trillion, we're talking about a figure that is unconceivably big, and we've simply shortened it to a G, because then we can actually talk about it. If I put all the noughts there, it's absurd. And that's what you're going to have to spend money on, to pull that out of the air? Nature did it far better. So that is a major deception, and politically required, politically oriented. And we've got to give people some hope, don't we? So I suggest at this stunning moment we have a cup of tea, and afterwards we'll look at this reality and what can be done.